Hi, Mark from Enchantment of Eternity here to tell you about 5 shows that Game of Thrones fans should be watching. So if you're like me, you were really bummed out by the news that Game of Thrones wouldn't be returning for season 7 until next June. So you might be going through withdrawals like a heroin addict trying to get your next GOT fix. But not to worry, because I'm here to tell you about 5 shows to keep you occupied during the long wait for season 7. To be clear, these aren't necessarily my favorite shows currently airing, but these are 5 shows I personally think that those who are already fans of Game of Thrones would particularly be more inclined to like, as they share similar qualities. These shows aren't all the same, and I can't guarantee that all Game of Thrones fans will like them, but if you absolutely love Game of Thrones, I would recommend that you give these 5 shows a shot. And I'll be looking at these shows from the perspective of a Game of Thrones fans, pointing out the similarities and why I think Game of Thrones fans should give them a try. So I'll go by the order of which show is returning soonest rather than having any particular order of recommendation, as I would recommend all these shows equally. So I'm going to start with the show that is currently airing and wrapping up its 2nd season, and that is Mr. Robot. Mr. Robot is just wrapping up its 2nd season in late September 2016. Its 3rd season will probably air in July of 2017. The channel it airs on in the US is USA. Another show Mr. Robot most resembles is Breaking Bad. Mr. Robot tells the story of an antisocial hacker named Elliot who has some mental instability issues. The show puts you inside his mindset through various stylized voiceover where you, the audience, play the part of his imaginary friend that he talks to, and the show tells the story on how he gets involved with a hacktivist group known as F Society, whose main goal is to take on the most powerful corporation in the world known as E Corp, which they attempt to bring to its knees. Mr. Robot is crafted in a very stylistic way that many people liken to David Fincher, with cinematography and editing as impressive as Breaking Bad. Mr. Robot may appeal to Game of Thrones fans because it has a cast of deep and interesting characters, and the show does a really good job at putting you in their mindset. And like Game of Thrones, whose fan base love to theorize and speculate, Mr. Robot tells complex stories that are also prone to fan theories, as they also are conducive to speculation. Also, Mr. Robot may appeal more to the fans of the more wild Game of Thrones theories, as Game of Thrones rarely tries to pull the wool over your eyes by fooling you. However, this is something that Mr. Robot loves to do. While Mr. Robot isn't a fantasy, it does feature a lot of complex characters that blur the lines between good and evil, and other Joffrey-type characters that you love to hate. That, coupled with this complex and cerebral storytelling, I believe makes Mr. Robot a great show that Game of Thrones fans should check out. Another show I believe Game of Thrones fans should be watching is Vikings. Vikings has aired 3.5 seasons thus far. Vikings returns for its 2nd half of season 4 sometime in the fall of 2016. The channel Vikings airs on in the US is the History Channel. Another show that Vikings most resembles is Rome. Like Game of Thrones, Vikings has a medieval type setting. Although, unlike Game of Thrones, rather than being fantasy, Vikings is based off real-life historical figures, so it's not so inducive to theorizing and speculation, as all one really needs to do is look at a history book. However, historical record from that time period is spotty at best, so the show does take a lot of artistic liberties in order to fill in some of these missing pieces. Vikings has a similar feel to Game of Thrones, as being a medieval drama with a lot of war and complexity to it. As in Game of Thrones, no one is really shown to be good or evil, as there are no real heroes or villains. However, there are certain characters that you do want to root for or may find despicable, just like in Game of Thrones. For example, the lead characters of Vikings are shown to do despicable things because it is historically accurate to what Vikings did. In my opinion, Vikings isn't quite as good as Game of Thrones, as its battles aren't as impressive, and it doesn't paint as detailed of a world, and at times the plot lines are a bit simplistic and familiar. But it is still an impressive show, and although it shares a lot of similarities with Thrones, it also has many differences as well. For example, Vikings spans a longer time frame as it does time jumps from time to time, as it will skip an entire decade in a single episode. Usually when shows do time jumps, I find it really jarring as it really takes you out of the story. However, when Vikings does it, they always pull it off really well, and it actually enhances the overall story because it skips over a lot of boring stuff that we didn't really need to see. And this also allows to see characters grow from children to adults. Vikings is oftentimes more slow-paced than Game of Thrones as well, but this allows for a lot of character drama, and the show does boast a rich cast of dynamic characters played by talented actors, which is always a plus. Vikings has almost 4 seasons to it so far, so there's a lot to catch up on to keep you busy while you're waiting for Game of Thrones to return. And another show Game of Thrones fans might enjoy watching is The Expanse. The Expanse has had 1 season thus far. Its 2nd season starts in January of 2017. The channel it airs on in the US is the Sci-Fi Channel. Another show that it most resembles is Battlestar Galactica. The Expanse could easily be referred to as Game of Thrones in space. This sci-fi show is based off of a series of novels written by Daniel Abraham and Ty Franck, who also worked very closely with the showrunners, and the show is said to follow the novels very closely. Daniel Abraham and Ty Franck have direct ties to George R.R. Martin, having worked with him on several projects and cited him as an influence on their novels. The Expanse is set in a futuristic setting where humanity has colonized the entire solar system, setting a new political dynamic between the superpowers in the solar system, Earth and Mars, who are currently engaged in a Cold War. However, the bulk of the series takes place in the asteroid belt, where there are a series of mining colonies that live in poverty, and there has arisen a terrorist organization known as the OPA. Like Game of Thrones, The Expanse follows multiple character arcs at different locations. At the start of the series, the scene switches between a detective on an asteroid colony looking for a missing person, a high-placed UN official on Earth, and the crew of a blue-collar mining vessel in the far reaches of the solar system. So it has a lot of the same feel of exploring an expansive world and getting to know the various facets of this world through its rich characters. The Expanse also has complex storytelling that is conducive to theories and speculation. Although at this stage, its source material is far ahead of it, so all one would really need to do is read the novels, which I plan on doing myself at some stage. Like Thrones, you never know what to expect as it breaks all typical conventions and it can go in unexpected directions. You can definitely see the influence of George R.R. Martin's writing style on this show, but its futuristic setting makes for a more modern telling of a power struggle that at this stage in the show is just getting started, as there are many fascinating mysteries introduced in the first season that boggle the mind, making The Expanse a must-watch for any Game of Thrones fan. Another show I think Game of Thrones fans should be watching is The Leftovers. The Leftovers has 2 seasons thus far. Its 3rd and final season airs January 2017. The channel it airs on in the US is HBO. Another show it most resembles is Lost. The Leftovers takes place 3 years after an event known as the Departure, where 2% of the world's population mysteriously vanished with no explanation whatsoever. And don't look for an explanation either, as it will never be explained, as this isn't the point of the show. The show more focuses on the family of the Garveys and how this event has affected them 3 years after it took place. You also get to see how this event affects their neighbors and the world at large through their eyes as well, so it tells the story of a global sweeping event, but in a personal way. Like Game of Thrones, The Leftovers features a rich cast of characters, not just the Garvey, but many other interesting characters that they encounter that are intriguing to follow. If you don't look for big explanations for many of the weird events that happen during the show, you can really enjoy the story, as those events aren't the point of it, they're just there to enhance the character stories. The Leftovers is probably the one show on the list that least outwardly resembles Game of Thrones, as it's more of a contemplative character drama than a sweeping fantasy epic. However, I believe it will appeal to Game of Thrones fans, as one of the main aspects of this show that it shares with Game of Thrones is a rich cast of fully developed characters that make you want to invest your time in. And like Thrones, it features complex storytelling where many could theorize and speculate over. The show probably more resembles Lost because it is also produced by Damon Lindelof, who acts as the showrunner. However, I wouldn't let that put anyone who was disappointed by Lost's ending off, as The Leftovers make it clear from the beginning that this show is focused on the characters and the mysteries will likely never be resolved. Season 1 of the show was the only season based off of a novel, as it covers the entirety of that novel in one season. The author of the novel worked closely with Lindelof to create Season 2 and will on Season 3 as well, which unlike Season 1 was not based on any source material. Season 1 had a very bleak and dark tone some may find off-putting, but I believe the great character stories shine through regardless. And Season 2, in my opinion, was a vast improvement on Season 1 and makes one of my favorite years of all of television, and I would argue as this kind of quality of storytelling that rivals Game of Thrones. And so I can't wait for Season 3, which the showrunners decided will be the final season, as they believe the story has run its course. So I have high hopes for this great show that you should definitely check out. The final show on my list I believe that Game of Thrones fans should be watching is Black Sails. Black Sails has aired 3 seasons thus far. Its 4th and final season starts January 2017. The channel it airs on in the US is Starz. Another show that it most resembles is Spartacus. Black Sails tells the story of an island in the Caribbean in the 18th century that is completely controlled by pirates, and the conflicts inner and outer that the pirates of the island encounter. It serves as a prequel to the classic novel Treasure Island, as it centers around Captain Flint, who is in that novel was mentioned as Long John Silver's former captain who had amassed a sizable treasure. We also get to see the origins of John Silver as he begins the series as a lonely cook. Black Sails also features many characters and situations inspired from real-life pirates and events and incorporates them into the story. Black Sails is a more action-adventure based show than many other shows on this list. However, like Thrones, it does have a cast of really interesting and deep characters. The show also bears resemblance in setting and action sequences to the film Pirates of the Caribbean, however without the cheesy supernatural beings or Johnny Depp doing his best Keith Richards impersonation. However, the show does try to stay more true to historical events, even if it always doesn't do it just right. Those who were off-put by the graphic sex and nudity in Game of Thrones may not care for this show, as I found it just as graphic, actually arguably more so. However, for those who consider this a plus, will probably really enjoy Black Sails. However, like Thrones, I would argue the sex and nudity only adds to the authenticity of the setting and the show and helps it feel like a real complex world. The storytelling in Black Sails is a bit more straightforward than some of these other shows, but it still manages to tell really engaging stories. And like Game of Thrones, it has multiple storylines set over multiple locations, and like Thrones, it does have characters who themselves are complex and blur the line between good and evil. And it tries to explore these complex themes very well, and it never comes off as black and white. The first season of the show, while not being completely horrible, is definitely the low point of the series, as it does come off as a tad bit like a typical TV series. However, if you stick with it, its second season, it really shines through and proves itself as a top quality show with sweeping character stories and unexpected turns to rival those seen in Thrones. And it features one of my favorite season finales I have ever seen. And this quality continues on to its third season, and I hope it does for its 4th season as well, as it is planned to be its final season. So I have faith that they can close out the show on a high note. So overall, if you like the action, adventure, sex, and intrigue aspects of Game of Thrones, then Black Sails is definitely a show you should check out. So these are the 5 shows I believe Game of Thrones fans should be watching. Thank you so much for checking out this video, and if this is your first time finding my channel, please be sure to check it out as I do extensive Game of Thrones coverage, from analysis videos to theory videos to reviews. I also cover many other shows such as Star Trek, Dark Matter, Better Call Saul, and The Walking Dead. And I also do the occasional movie review or top 10 list. So please be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.